Sterling Voss hadn't laughed in 3 years. His physician noted it in his file. His men could spot his fake smiles from across the room. The man beneath the steel had vanished. Everyone remembered him, but no one actually met him anymore. His father died 3 years ago. Not suddenly. Parkinson's had worn him down for years, but the final 18 months completely dragged him away, long enough for Sterling to watch the man who'd taught him to ride dissolve into someone who couldn't remember his own son's name. He held his father's hand, crushed 3 rebellions, and when the old man finally went, he didn't stop. Sealed everything. Kept running. 3 years. Then one October night, he rode to his father's secret farm and found a light in the old stable. He put his hand on his weapon, pushed the door open, and saw a red-haired woman lying in the straw, humming to his father's old mare. The horse that hadn't let anyone touch her in 3 years. The horse he couldn't bear to look at. And she was lying still, eyes closed, trusting this stranger completely. Then the mare lurched up, caught the woman's jacket under the strap, yanked her into the air, tools scattering everywhere, and she laughed wild, breathless, the kind of laugh that meant she'd lost all control, and was delighted about it. Sterling stood in that doorway at 2 a.m., hand on his weapon, and something inside his chest sealed for 3 years cracked. He didn't know her name. He only knew his father's horse trusted her. And if that horse, after 3 years, still knew how to trust someone, maybe he could too. If this story touched you, hit like, share it, and subscribe so you don't miss what's next. Now let's go back to that October night, when Sterling took his hand off his weapon and stepped inside. Sterling stepped across the threshold of the stable, and the smell of damp straw rushed into his face like a buried memory clawing its way back to the surface. His steps were slow, one at a time, stopping about 3 meters from the old horse. Phoebe was still hanging there, her flannel jacket caught tightly beneath Duchess's breast collar, one hand gripping the horse's mane while the other tried to reach the tool bag lying on its side on the floor. She looked up at him, her auburn red hair fallen loose, straw scattered over her shoulders, the freckles on her nose wrinkling because she still hadn't stopped laughing. "Oh, good," she said, breathless but not panicked at all. "Can you please tell my patient that I'm trying to help her, not trying to ride her at 2 o'clock in the morning?" Sterling didn't answer. He took his hand away from the hidden holster at his side, stepped closer to Duchess, and did the thing he hadn't dared to do for 3 years. He placed his hand on the old horse's neck. His hand paused for a moment before touching her, as if the horse's coat might burn him. Then he touched her, and his mouth opened, whispering in a voice he thought he had forgotten. The low, slow, gentle voice, soft as wind moving through grass, the voice his father had used every morning when leading Duchess out to the field. "Easy, girl. Easy." Duchess turned her head and looked at him. The old horse's eyes, cloudy and tired, stopped on Sterling's face as though searching for someone behind that face. Then the horse let out a long breath, stepped to the left, and Phoebe dropped into the pile of straw with one neat thud and a fresh burst of laughter. She sat up, brushed straw from her hair, and the first thing she did wasn't look at him. She looked at Duchess. "You okay, girl?" she asked the horse, her voice suddenly much softer, entirely different from the way she had been talking a moment ago. She stood, stepped toward Duchess, placed a hand on the horse's hip, and pressed gently. Duchess shifted slightly, lifting her left hind leg, then lowering it again. Phoebe frowned. Only then did she turn to Sterling. "She's got pretty severe arthritis in her left stifle," she said, her voice turning professional, concise, clear, like someone who had said this sentence hundreds of times, to hundreds of different horse owners. "I heard her crying from the road. My truck died about half a mile from here, and I was walking to find a place with phone service when I heard a horse in pain, so I climbed the fence and came in. I know this is private property. I know I shouldn't be here." She stopped and looked straight into his eyes. But the horse was hurting. She said that sentence as if it explained everything. And to her, it truly did explain everything. Sterling recognized that in the way she stood. Back straight, shoulders open, eyes not looking away, but when he relaxed his guard completely and stepped back, he saw it. Her hands were shaking. Only slightly. In the fingers, in the wrists. The kind of tremor that came from someone who had held herself calm by sheer will for 10 minutes, and now her body was demanding repayment. She was afraid. She was only afraid after the danger had passed. Sterling said nothing about it. He bent down, picked up the tool bag, and handed it to her. "Examine her," he said. Phoebe looked at him, looked at the tool bag, then looked at Duchess. She took the bag, opened it, and began to work. She worked for 3 hours. Sterling stood beside Duchess, holding the reins when Phoebe needed him to, handing her tools when she asked, not questioning, not speaking, only being there. He watched the way she moved around the old horse, certain and smooth, the soles of her rubber boots worn thin, her flannel shirt faded from 100 washings, her palms calloused but so gentle that Duchess didn't flinch even once. She knew what she was doing. Not the way someone knew from books, the way someone knew from having done this thousands of times, in thousands of stables, with thousands of different horses. When morning came and the first light seeped through the gaps in the stable boards, Phoebe stood, wiped her hands on her jeans, and said, "The good news is she doesn't have anything serious besides arthritis. The bad news is this arthritis has gone untreated for a long time, and the joint has degenerated a lot. She needs weekly care, anti-inflammatory injections, joint massage, walking exercises. Without that, she won't make it through the winter." She said it while looking straight at him, without softening it, without circling around it. Then she asked, "Are you paying now, or should I put it on a tab?" Sterling looked at Phoebe Wynne, the red-haired veterinarian covered in straw, standing in his father's stable at dawn, asking him about payment for treating a horse with the attitude of someone who didn't know and didn't care who he was. Then he looked at Duchess, the old horse standing more peacefully than he had seen her stand in 3 years. "Every week," he said. "You come every week." Phoebe nodded, put her tools back into the bag, slung it over her shoulder, and walked toward the stable door. At the threshold, she stopped and turned her head. "There's one thing my grandmother taught me. She said horses can feel human energy. If you bring grief into a stable, they'll know, and they'll be afraid." She looked at Duchess, then at Sterling. "This horse isn't afraid of me, but she's been afraid of something in this stable for a very long time. You should think about what that is." She walked away into the early light, small frame, worn boots, tool bag knocking against her hip, heading back toward the dead truck half a mile away. Sterling stood at the stable door, watching her until she disappeared around the bend. Then he turned back to Duchess. The horse looked at him, and he knew exactly what Duchess had been afraid of in this stable for 3 years. She was afraid of the emptiness left by the person who had abandoned her. He was afraid of the same thing. 1 week later, Sterling parked at the ranch gate at 8 o'clock in the morning. His appointment with Phoebe was at 9. He sat in the car, looking through the windshield toward the old stable at the end of the dirt road, and didn't open the door. 6 days earlier, he had stood at the door of that stable and watched a stranger heel his father's horse, while he, the man who owned that horse, had neglected her for 3 years. For 6 nights in a row, he had returned here in his mind, seeing again Duchess's clouded, tired eyes turning toward him, searching for the man who hadn't come. And every night, he wondered what would happen if he walked into the stable alone, without Phoebe, without anyone standing between him and the horse. And Duchess looked at him and didn't recognize him, the way his father hadn't recognized him. So he sat at the gate, hesitating, his hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. The man who ran an empire stretching along the East Coast, afraid to step into a stable. Phoebe's old truck appeared at the end of the road at 8:45, rattling as if it were about to fall apart piece by piece, white smoke coughing from the exhaust pipe. She parked beside his car, jumped down, tool bag on her shoulder, rubber boots still streaked with mud from some earlier call. She looked at him sitting in the car, looked toward the stable in the distance, then looked back at him. She didn't ask why he hadn't gone in, didn't ask how long he had been there early. She only tapped twice on the car window and said, "Bring this." Then she handed him a horse brush. Sterling took the brush and followed Phoebe into the stable like a man who didn't know where he was going but trusted the one leading him. Duchess stood in the corner of the stall, where the morning light poured through the gaps between the boards. The old horse lifted her head when she heard their footsteps, ears pricking, eyes stopping on Sterling. He stopped, about 2 meters from Duchess. His feet refused to take another step. Phoebe didn't look at him. She stepped over to Duchess, placed a hand on the horse's muzzle, whispered something, then turned and said in the most ordinary voice in the world, "Stand on her left side. Brush with the grain. Start at the neck." Sterling moved to the place she had pointed to. He placed the brush against Duchess's neck. His hand didn't brush. His hand only rested there, frozen, the brush touching the horse's coat but not moving, as if his brain had sent the order and his body had refused to obey. 3 years. 3 years since he had touched this horse. 3 years Duchess had stood alone in the stable, waiting for someone who wouldn't come, and had become a horse who wouldn't let anyone touch her. He had done that to her, the same way he had done it to himself. Phoebe stepped closer, placed her hand over his, gently but firmly, the way someone handled frightened living things. "Just leave it there," she said. "Don't try to do anything. Just keep your hand there. Duchess will let you know when she's ready." Phoebe's hand was warm. That was the first thing Sterling noticed, before the horsehair beneath the brush, before Duchess's breath against his arm. Her hand was warm and calloused, and steady in the way only the hand of someone who did hard work every day could be. She held his hand there for about 10 seconds, then let go, turned to open her tool bag, and began preparing Duchess's anti-inflammatory injection. And Sterling stood there, his hand on the horse's neck, the brush unmoving, waiting. Duchess turned her head. Slowly, the old horse's eyes looking at him, sniffing his hand, her warm breath washing over his fingers. The horse stood still, didn't move away, didn't flinch, only stood there and let him be there. That silent moment probably lasted only a few seconds, but to Sterling, it felt longer than the past 3 years put together, because in those 3 years there had been no moment when he had truly felt anything, and now he could feel the horse's coat beneath his hand, the breath on his fingers, and the weight of all those mornings when his father had led this horse out, mornings he would never get to see again. Phoebe worked around Duchess, giving the injection, checking the joint, massaging the stifle, and every now and then Sterling asked questions. Not big questions, small, specific ones. "Why do you touch her ear before the injection?" Phoebe answered without looking up. "Horses have a lot of nerves in their ears. Touching there before doing something painful is like telling them, 'I'm here. I'm not going to surprise you.'" "Who taught you that?" "My grandmother, Grandma Marisol. She was a veterinarian in Andalusia before she came to America. She said horses don't understand human words, but they understand the language of hands. If your hands tell the truth, a horse will listen." She spoke about Grandma Marisol briefly, without telling a life story, just enough for Sterling to understand that everything she knew had come from a woman she clearly loved more than anyone in the world. She didn't say whether her grandmother was still alive or gone, but in the way she mentioned her, in the past tense, with her voice softening a little at the end of the sentence, Sterling knew. He knew because he spoke about his father in exactly the same voice. When Phoebe finished, she stood, looked at the brush still lying motionless in Sterling's hand, and said, "Next week you brush. Today, letting it rest, there is enough." She slung the bag over her shoulder and stepped out. Sterling remained in the stable for a while longer, his hand still on Duchess's neck, the brush still not having made a single stroke. But he was there, and Duchess let him be there, and sometimes, beginning again only needs that much. On the second Tuesday, Sterling arrived at 8 o'clock. Phoebe's appointment was at 9. He stood at the ranch gate, didn't go in, and waited until her old truck appeared at the end of the road before following her into the stable, as if she were the key and the stable were a lock he couldn't open by himself. On the third Tuesday, he arrived at 7:30. On the fourth Tuesday, 7 o'clock. Each week, he came 15 minutes earlier than the week before, and each week, he stayed 15 minutes longer after Phoebe left, standing in the stable with Duchess, the brush in his hand, making slow, clumsy strokes that no one saw. He didn't tell anyone about this. He didn't need to. Conrad Brandt, Sterling's chief bodyguard, the man who had followed him through 15 years and 3 territorial wars, noticed the pattern from the second week. Conrad wasn't the kind of man who missed details. When the boss disappeared every Tuesday, took no bodyguards with him, announced no route, and returned with the smell of hay on his suit jacket, Conrad took note. He decided not to text Dr. Curran just yet, keeping the observation strictly to himself. He only wrote it in his personal tracking notebook in 3 words: ranch, woman. Then he closed the notebook. Conrad had served Ephraim Voss before serving Sterling, and he understood one thing most men in the organization didn't understand. Sterling wasn't a machine. Sterling was a man pretending to be a machine, and any machine that ran without stopping for 3 years would burn out. If a horse ranch and a red-haired woman could keep Sterling Voss from burning to ash, Conrad was willing to write it in his notebook every week without asking a single question. By the 3rd week, Sterling noticed that Phoebe drank coffee from a rusted thermos, and the coffee inside had clearly gone cold since the moment she left her trailer early that morning. The next Tuesday, he brought a cup of hot coffee. He said nothing. He only set it on the stall rail when she walked in. Phoebe looked at the coffee, looked at him, took a sip, and went on working as if men putting hot coffee on the rail for her at 7 o'clock in the morning was something that happened every day. But Sterling saw that she finished that cup before she touched the rusted thermos. The next week, he brought a sandwich too, because the week before, she had worked 4 hours straight without eating, and when he asked whether she had eaten breakfast, she looked at him with the sincere expression of someone who truly couldn't remember when her last meal had been. She forgot to eat when she worked. She forgot to drink water. She forgot that she, too, was a living creature who needed care just like the horses she cared for. And Sterling, who had forgotten how to feel anything for 3 years, recognized that in her before he recognized it in himself. He began asking questions while she worked. Not big questions. Not, "Who are you?" or "What has your life been like?" Small questions, specific ones. "Why do you always stand on the left?" Because most horses are trained from the left. If you come from the right, they'll get uneasy. "Why do you talk to Duchess before touching her?" Because would you want someone touching you without warning? She answered without stopping her hands, her voice ordinary, but Sterling noticed one small thing she probably didn't know about herself. Each time he asked, her hands slowed by half a beat, not because the question was hard, because she wasn't used to it. Phoebe Wynne was better at talking to horses than to people. She knew how to read every tremor in a horse's muscles, every flick of an ear, every breath, but with people, she kept distance, through professionalism, through the efficient, tidy voice of a doctor at work. No one asked her why. No one cared which side she stood on. Until Sterling, the man who sat on a hay bale in the stable every Tuesday, and asked her about the smallest details as if her answer were the most important thing he would hear all week. And it was. At the end of the 4th week, when Phoebe packed her tools into her bag and got ready to leave, Sterling handed her a small piece of paper. On it was a phone number. "If the horse has a problem," he said, "call this number. Anytime." Phoebe looked at the paper. "Is this your number?" "It's the number for horse emergencies." She tucked the paper into the pocket of her flannel shirt, nodded, and walked out. She drove the rattling truck toward the main road, and halfway down the road, she stopped the truck, sat still, looked at the piece of paper. Because Phoebe Wynne had lived alone long enough to know when someone was making an effort, Sterling Voss had bought a new phone, a new number, just so she could call him at 2 o'clock in the morning if an old horse's joints hurt. He didn't say, "Call me." He said, "Call this number," as if he were only a veterinary hotline and not the man searching for a reason to hear her voice. Phoebe folded the paper carefully and placed it in the smallest compartment of her wallet, the place where she kept the only photograph she had of Grandma Marisol. Then she started the truck and drove on. The prepaid phone rang at 2:17 on the morning of the 5th Tuesday. Sterling wasn't asleep. He didn't sleep most nights. Only lay in the darkness of the penthouse, staring at the ceiling and running his empire through his head until the sun came up. But tonight, when the phone screen lit with the only number saved in it, he sat up before the second ring could sound. "Duchess has colic. Come now." Phoebe's voice sounded like no other time he had heard it before. Not calm, not humorous. Brief, sharp, urgent. The voice of someone counting every minute because she knew every minute mattered. She hung up before he could answer. Sterling put on a suit, armed himself by sheer instinct, and drove through the night to Blue Ridge in an hour. He didn't remember how many red lights he ran. He didn't care. When he reached the ranch, the stable lights were on. The door was wide open, and Phoebe's old truck was parked crooked on the grass as if she had slammed the brakes and jumped out running. He stepped into the stable and saw Duchess lying on her side on the straw floor. The old horse was breathing fast and shallow, her belly swollen tight in a way that wasn't normal, her eyes wide and white with the silent panic of a creature in pain without understanding why. Phoebe was kneeling beside Duchess, one hand on the horse's abdomen, listening, pressing, checking. She had changed completely. The woman who had laughed wildly in the stable at 2 o'clock in the morning 5 weeks earlier had vanished. In her place was a doctor. Her eyes were absolutely focused, every movement precise and economical, not one action wasted. Her flannel sleeves were rolled to the elbows, her red hair tied with an elastic, her face cold and readable, as a medical book turning page by page. Sterling had seen steel in many people, in his men, in his enemies, in himself in the mirror every morning. But Phoebe's steel was different. Hers wasn't used to destroy. It was used to keep something alive. Hold her head, Phoebe said without looking up. Kneel down. Put her head in your lap. Keep her still. She'll try to get up. Don't let her stand. If she rolls, her intestines could twist more. And talk to her. Anything. She needs to hear a human voice. She ordered him as if ordering an assistant in an operating room, not polite, no further explanation, not caring who he was outside this stable. Inside this stable, she was the one with authority, and he was the one holding the tools. Sterling knelt, put Duchess's head in his lap. The old horse was heavy, warm, breathing hard beneath his hands, her muscles trembling continuously. Duchess's eyes looked up at him, clouded, hurting, and frightened. And Sterling looked down into those eyes and saw his father. Not as a metaphor. He looked into the eyes of the old horse in pain and saw the 18 months his father had spent lying in bed, eyes open wide, not understanding what was happening, body betraying him, memory betraying him, everything betraying him except the son's hand holding his tightly. He began to speak, in his father's voice. That low, slow, gentle voice Ephraim Voss had used every morning when leading Duchess out to the pasture. The voice Sterling thought had died with his father but had only been sleeping somewhere inside him, waiting for an old horse with a stomachache at 2 o'clock in the morning to wake up. Easy, girl. Father's here. Father's here. He didn't realize he had said father instead of I. Phoebe noticed. She said nothing. 4 hours. Phoebe worked for 4 straight hours. She injected pain medication, injected muscle relaxant, checked the pulse, listened to the gut, massaged the horse's abdomen with her bare hands until her arms trembled from exhaustion, then switched hands and kept going. She led Duchess to her feet, walked her around the stable, slowly, 1 step at a time, patiently, then let her lie down again, repeated it, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times. Sterling held Duchess's head every time she lay down, speaking continuously in his father's voice, telling the horse about the mornings Ephraim had once led her through dew, wet grass, about the way he sang while brushing her coat, about the autumn when he bought Duchess from the ranch down south and drove 4 hours to bring her home. Because this horse looked at me with the eyes of someone searching for a home, and I know what that feels like. He told her things he thought he had forgotten. They poured out in the darkness of the stable, among the smell of straw and veterinary medicine, pouring out as if his mouth had waited 3 years to open. Dawn came. Light seeped through the gaps in the boards. Pale gold. Fragile. Duchess was breathing evenly. Her belly had softened. The horse's eyes were closed. Peaceful. The kind of peace that belongs to a creature that has passed through pain and is resting. Phoebe sat with her back against the stable wall, both hands hanging loose over her knees, her face gray with exhaustion, her red hair fallen loose and stuck with straw. She looked at Duchess, then at Sterling, and said 2 words. She'll live. Sterling was still kneeling, Duchess's head still in his lap, his hand still resting on the horse's neck, and his shoulders shook, slightly, almost impossible to see. Not crying. Sterling Voss didn't know how to cry anymore. 3 sealed years had stolen even that from him, but this was the closest thing. A tremor in his shoulders, a tremor in his jaw, a tremor somewhere deep inside his chest where he thought everything had died but had only been waiting. Phoebe saw it. She didn't say, "Are you okay?" Didn't say, "Cry, it'll be easier." Didn't say anything at all. She only stood slowly, came over, sat down beside him on the stable floor, shoulder touching shoulder, and stayed there, silent. The 2 of them sat in the stable at dawn, the old horse breathing steadily between them, morning light spilling over the straw, and no one said anything because there was nothing that needed to be said. Sometimes being beside someone in silence is enough. Sometimes that is everything. That afternoon, Sterling called Conrad Brandt. "I need to tell you something," he said. "There's a ranch in Blue Ridge. My father bought it under a false name 30 years ago. No one in the organization knows it exists. I want to keep it that way. But I need you to know the location in case the horse there gets sick again." Conrad was silent for a moment. Then, "The horse, sir?" "The horse," Sterling said. And Conrad, who had followed Sterling through 15 years and had never heard his boss speak about anything living in that voice, wrote down the address without asking another question. In the 6th week, Sterling arrived at the ranch at 7 o'clock in the morning and saw that Phoebe was already there before him. She was leading Duchess in circles around the grassy yard in front of the stable, slowly, 1 step at a time, the reins loose in her hand, patiently waiting each time the old horse stopped because her stifle hurt. Duchess stopped more than she walked. Every 4 or 5 steps, she stopped again, her left hind leg lifting and lowering with hesitation, and Phoebe stood beside her and waited, not urging, not pulling, only standing there until Duchess chose to take the next step on her own. Sterling stood at the fence watching, and the words came out of his mouth before he could decide to say them. My father used to lead this horse like that. Every morning, even when his hands shook so badly he couldn't hold the reins, he still wrapped them around his wrist and walked her. Phoebe stopped. Duchess stopped. Both of them turned their heads to look at him, and Sterling thought that in that moment, the horse and the woman wore the same expression, patient, waiting, ready to listen. He hadn't meant to tell her. For 6 weeks, he had come to this ranch every Tuesday and hadn't spoken about his father once, except for the night of the colic when he had spoken in his father's voice without knowing it. But watching Phoebe lead Duchess slowly through the early light, patient with every painful step, gentle with every pause, he saw his father there. He saw Ephraim Voss in the way his father had treated this horse for 20 years, saw him in the way Phoebe didn't rush Duchess, saw him in the smell of morning grass, wet with dew, and the wall inside his chest, the thing that had held everything in for 3 years, began to tremble. My father's name was Ephraim, he said, his voice flat, controlled. The voice he used in boardrooms when reading numbers without emotion. He built everything I'm running now, from nothing, with his bare hands. He was the strongest man I knew. He stopped. Then his closest partner betrayed him, the person he trusted most. Pulled down everything he'd built, while he wasn't guarded. My father collapsed. And when he collapsed, Parkinson's was already there, waiting, as if the disease knew exactly when his body would be weakest before it began. His voice was still flat, but his hand gripped the fence so tightly the old wood creaked. 18 months. I watched him come apart. From a man who could gentle wild horses with his voice, into a man who couldn't hold a spoon, then into a man who couldn't remember my name. I sat beside his bed every night, holding his hand, and during the day I kept everything he had built from collapsing with him. 3 rebellions inside the organization. Twice, I nearly lost everything. I handled all of it. With one hand, the other was holding my father's. He looked at Duchess. When he died, I didn't stop. No funeral, not one day. Because if I stopped, everything would fall. So I sealed it. The grief, the memories, the laughter, all of it. Shut it all away and kept running. 3 years. Phoebe didn't say anything the entire time he spoke. She stood beside Duchess, her hand on the reins, her face expressionless, but not because she was cold. Because she was listening. Listening in a way Sterling had never seen anyone listen to him. Not listening to answer, but listening to stay. When he stopped, silence stretched out, with only Duchess's breathing and the sound of early birds in the distant bushes. Then Phoebe said, My grandmother's name was Marisol. She had cancer. 11 months from the day they found it to the day she died. She didn't lose her memory. She remembered everything until the last minute. She remembered my name. Remembered the name of every horse she had ever treated. Remembered the smell of orange blossoms in Andalusia. And she remembered that she was dying. Every day she looked at me and she knew, and I knew she knew, and neither of us said it. She stopped. The day she died, I drove to a client's ranch and worked 12 hours straight. Examined 4 horses, vaccinated 6, trimmed 2, didn't cry, didn't stop. She looked at Sterling. Just like you. Silence. Then Sterling asked softly, as if he were afraid of the answer. How did you get out of it? Phoebe looked at Duchess, the old horse standing still between them, her leg hurting, her joint inflamed, but still standing. I haven't, she said. I haven't gotten out. I've only learned that grief doesn't need to be escaped. It needs to be lived with, like Duchess. Her arthritis will never go away. That joint will hurt until the day she dies, but she can still walk. 1 step at a time, slowly. If someone patient leads her every day. She didn't say, I'll lead you. She didn't say, let me help. She only talked about the horse and let him understand it himself. Sterling understood, and Duchess, as if the old horse had heard enough of 2 human beings exchanging their grief and had decided the conversation was over, turned her head and shoved Sterling hard in the back, hard enough that he staggered forward 2 steps and nearly fell, his hand grabbing the fence. It was an old habit. Ephraim had once told Sterling that Duchess always shoved him in the back whenever he stood too long, demanding to move on, demanding that he stop standing still and lead her forward. The horse hadn't shoved anyone for 3 years because no one had stood close enough to be shoved. Phoebe looked at Sterling staggering against the fence with a stunned expression, and she laughed, not loudly. A short, unexpected laugh that slipped out before she could hold it back. The kind of laugh the body decides on before the mind has time to allow it. And Sterling, one hand on the fence, his back just shoved by an old horse, looked at Phoebe laughing, and his mouth opened, and the sound that came out of it was laughter, rusted, brief, awkward, like someone learning to speak again after a stroke, but real. Real in a way nothing in Sterling Voss's life had been real for the past 3 years. Phoebe heard that laugh and stopped. Her eyes changed. Not much, only softened a little at the corners, the kind of change only someone used to reading the expressions of frightened creatures would notice. She didn't say, "You just laughed." Didn't say, "First time, wasn't it?" She only turned to Duchess, patted the horse's neck gently, and said, "Good girl." As if the horse had just done the thing she had been waiting for, but hadn't dared to hope for. Then she continued leading Duchess, one step at a time, slowly, patiently, and Sterling followed, his back still aching from being shoved, his mouth still carrying the strange taste of laughter, and for the first time in 3 years, he walked without feeling as if he were running. On the 7th Tuesday, Phoebe turned onto the dirt road, leading to the ranch, and hit the brakes. 3 black SUVs were parked along the fence, glossy, spotless, expensive enough to look as if they belonged to another planet compared with her rusted truck. 4 men stood around the vehicles, black suits, earpieces, their posture stiff and military straight, their eyes constantly scanning the area. Phoebe looked at the scene, looked back at her old truck with dried mud on the front bumper and a coil of rope rolling around on the passenger seat, then turned off the engine, jumped down, slung her tool bag over her shoulder, and walked straight toward the stable. One of the 4 men stepped out to block her, almost a head taller than she was. Broad shoulders, shaved head, salt and pepper beard, dark brown eyes sweeping her from head to toe with the quick, clean assessment of someone who had done this job for a very long time. Conrad Brandt. She didn't know his name yet. "This area is restricted, ma'am." "I have a horse appointment at 9 o'clock, Phoebe said, her voice ordinary, as if she walked through security fences every day. "The horse's name is Duchess. Arthritis in the left stifle. 7th week of anti-inflammatory treatment. If I'm late with the injection, the joint will swell again, and recovery will take 2 weeks instead of 3 days. Do you want to inspect my tool bag, or are you letting me through?" Conrad looked at her. Looked at the faded tool bag on her shoulder, the rubber boots stained with mud, the red hair held up with a pencil, the freckles on her nose. This was the stable girl, the woman the boss disappeared for every Tuesday. The woman Conrad had written into his notebook for 7 straight weeks with 2 words, ranch and woman. Conrad stepped aside and let her pass without saying another word. Phoebe went straight into the stable, examined Duchess, gave the anti-inflammatory injection, checked the joint, massaged the stifle, led her through her exercise walk, and finished everything in 2 hours like every other Tuesday. Sterling didn't appear. She heard his voice carrying from the shed on the other side of the yard. Low, even, the voice of command rather than conversation, and the voices of several other men answering with yes and understood, along with the heavy sounds of a meeting no one wanted to attend. When she was done, she packed her tools into the bag, patted Duchess's neck gently, stepped out, walked past the 4 men in suits who were looking at her like a creature from another planet, climbed into her truck, and shut the door. Then she sat there, opened her phone, typed 2 words into the search bar, Sterling Voss. The results appeared in less than 1 second, and the world Phoebe thought she was standing in changed completely. An investigative article from the Washington Post, 3 years earlier, about the Voss family and its business network stretching along the East Coast. A photograph of Sterling walking out of federal court in Richmond, black suit, expressionless face, lawyers on both sides, allegations without convictions. The word organization appeared 17 times in one article. The word empire appeared 9 times. No sentence said directly what he was, but the space between those words said enough. Phoebe read for 15 minutes. Then she turned off the phone and looked through the windshield of the truck toward the stable where she had just examined Duchess, where for the past 6 weeks she had been teaching a man how to touch his father's horse again, where last week he had laughed for the first time in 3 years, and she realized that everything she knew about Sterling Voss was true. He was the man who spoke in his father's voice to a horse with colic at 2 o'clock in the morning. He was also the thing those 17 uses of the word organization in that article suggested. Both were real. She picked up the phone and called the prepaid number. Sterling answered after the first ring. "I just looked up your name online," she said, her voice flat, not shaking, not angry. "Meet me at the cafe on Route 7. 6 o'clock tonight. Don't bring anyone in a suit." She hung up. The cafe on Route 7 was small, old, lit with yellow lights, the kind of place where farmers and veterinarians stopped for cheap coffee between calls. Phoebe arrived first, sat in the corner, ordered black coffee, and waited. Sterling came in exactly at 6 o'clock. No suit, shirt sleeves rolled up, dark pants, no bodyguards. He sat across from her. His face was calm, but his eyes weren't. There was something in them Phoebe had never seen there before, something like fear. "It changes everything," Phoebe said. "I'm not angry that you didn't tell me. I understand why. But now I know, and I need you to answer one question. Straight. No circling around. Am I safe?" Sterling looked at her. Looked for a long time. Then he said, "Not completely." Phoebe didn't blink. "Go on." "No one close to me is completely safe. That's the truth. And I won't lie to you about it. But protecting what matters is what I do best. It's the only thing I know I'm good at." "Does Duchess rank above me on the priority list?" Phoebe asked, and her voice softened a little at the end of the sentence. Enough for Sterling to understand that she wasn't only asking about the horse. "Duchess ranks second," he said. "Since about the 3rd week." Phoebe took a sip of coffee, set the cup down, looked at him. "I'll keep taking care of Duchess. Every Tuesday, as usual. The rest, you and me, I need time." "How long?" "Until I know for sure that I'm choosing Sterling, the man in the stable. Not the version I want you to be. Not the story I'm telling myself in my head to make everything easier. I need to know I'm choosing the truth, not an illusion." Sterling nodded, didn't argue, didn't promise, didn't try to persuade her. Only nodded, because Phoebe Wynne had just told him she needed the truth, and the least he could do was respect that by not adding a single unnecessary word. They sat in the cheap cafe on Route 7 for another 40 minutes. They didn't talk about the organization, didn't talk about the courthouse or the article. Phoebe asked whether Duchess had eaten well today. Sterling said she had finished all her afternoon hay. Phoebe nodded and said next week she would increase the anti-inflammatory dosage because the joint was responding well. And they talked about the horse as if the horse were the only thing between them, because at that moment, the horse truly was the only thing both of them were sure of. In the 8th week, Phoebe dozed off while examining Duchess. She was kneeling beside the old horse's hind leg, one hand resting on the stifle, checking the degree of swelling, and her head dipped, only for 1 second, maybe 2. Then she startled awake, blinked, and continued as if nothing had happened. But Sterling saw it. He was standing in the corner of the stable as he did every Tuesday, the brush in his hand, and he saw her head dip, saw her hand jerk, saw her eyes open with the brief panic of someone who didn't know she had just fallen asleep. Then he saw other things he hadn't noticed 6 weeks earlier. The dark circles beneath her eyes were deeper than the week before. Her hand trembled when she held the syringe, only slightly. But in someone with hands as steady as Phoebe's, slight was already too much. She was thinner. Her collarbone stood out beneath the collar of her flannel shirt, and that shirt looked looser on her than he remembered. "You dozed off," he said. "I didn't doze off. I just watched you doze off. I closed my eyes to concentrate. My grandmother's technique." "Your grandmother taught you to doze off while holding a syringe?" Phoebe looked at him with the expression of someone caught red-handed but refusing to admit it. "I'm fine." Those 2 words sounded familiar. Sterling heard them every day, from his own mouth, for 3 years. "I'm fine," was the sentence of someone who wasn't fine, but had grown so used to it that they believed not being fine was normal. He didn't ask more. Phoebe Wynne wasn't the kind of person who answered when pressured. She was the kind of person who built walls out of professionalism, out of, "I'm fine," out of caring for every living creature around her except herself, and anyone who tried to push against that wall would only make it thicker. That afternoon, Sterling called Conrad. "Find out about Phoebe Wynne. Everything. Finances, history, family. Don't let her know." Conrad was silent for 2 seconds. The kind of silence Sterling knew meant his chief bodyguard was considering saying something beyond his duty, then deciding not to. "Yes, sir." 2 days later, Conrad placed a thin file on Sterling's desk. Thin because Phoebe Wynn's life didn't have much paperwork. Orphaned at 7 years old. Parents killed in an accident on Highway 42 outside Roanoke. Raised by her grandmother, Marisol Wynn, a veterinarian of Spanish descent who had immigrated from Seville at 26. Grandma Marisol raised her on the income she earned treating horses at the ranches around Blue Ridge, taught her everything from how to help deliver a foal to how to place a stethoscope against a horse's abdomen without startling it. Phoebe studied veterinary medicine at Virginia Tech on a partial scholarship and borrowed the rest. Grandma Marisol died 3 years ago. Cancer. 11 months. She left Phoebe an old truck, a set of veterinary tools, and nothing else. No house, no land, no savings, no family. Student loan debt, $80,000. Monthly installments, 2 months overdue. The bank had sent the third notice. If she didn't pay within 30 days, they would repossess the truck. The truck was her only way to earn a living. Lose the truck, lose the ability to reach ranches to examine horses, lose the horse calls, lose income, lose everything. Phoebe was taking night calls in 3 different counties to make up the money. Driving that rusted truck through Blue Ridge at 11 o'clock at night, examining a horse with stomach pain at midnight, driving back to her trailer at 3 o'clock in the morning, sleeping 3 hours, waking at 6, driving to Sterling's ranch at 7 days a week. No days off, no full meals, because food money was debt money. Sterling read the file twice, the first time with his eyes, the second time with something deeper. Something in the place where the wall in his chest had cracked, where every number in her debt hurt as if it belonged to him. $80,000. He could pay it with 1 phone call. He could erase the debt before Phoebe even knew. He could buy her a new truck, new tools, a new trailer, all of it. And she would hate him for it. Not because of the money, because it would mean she wasn't enough. Phoebe Wynn had lived alone since she was 7 years old, had put herself through college, had buried her grandmother, and kept working that same day, had built a life with 2 calloused hands and a rusted truck, and anyone who came in and paid her debt for her would be saying, "You couldn't do it," and Phoebe would rather lose the truck than hear that sentence. Sterling understood, because he was the same way. For the past 3 years, he had refused every offer of help, refused grief, refused weakness, because admitting he needed someone meant admitting he wasn't enough. They were alike in that way, 2 people building walls out of self-reliance, and both of them were suffocating behind those walls without knowing it. He didn't pay her debt. He didn't buy the truck. He didn't do anything she could refuse. Instead, he opened the drawer of his desk, took out the ranch papers for the land his father had bought under a false name 30 years earlier, and called his lawyer. "I want to transfer the Blue Ridge Ranch from the false name into my legal name. Make it fully legitimate. Deed, permits, everything. Sir, that will make the ranch appear in public records. Anyone searching for your assets will be able to find it. I know." He wasn't doing it for Phoebe. He was doing it because if one day he didn't come back, if the world he lived in swallowed him the way it had swallowed his father, he wanted Duchess to have a home that couldn't disappear. He wanted the land his father had bought to exist under a real name, not a ghost. And deeper, in a place he wasn't ready to admit yet, he wanted Phoebe to have somewhere to come every Tuesday, even if he was no longer standing at the fence waiting for her. Sterling Voss had lived for 3 years like a machine that needed no one. And now, sitting in his office at midnight, signing papers to legalize a horse ranch, he was doing the one thing a machine would never do. He was planning for his own absence, not so the empire would survive, but so an old horse and an exhausted veterinarian would have a place to stand. In the 9th week, a man named Jerome Voss sat in his private office in Richmond and opened his computer screen to Virginia's public real estate records. Jerome was Sterling's biological uncle, the deputy in the organization, the man who had stood beside Ephraim 30 years earlier when Ephraim built the empire, and had stood beside Sterling for the past 3 years while Sterling ran it. Jerome had salt and pepper hair combed back, a thin face, pale green eyes like Ephraim's but colder, and a smile Sterling had once described to Conrad as the smile of a man counting money in his head while shaking your hand. During the 3 years Sterling had turned to stone, Jerome had used his nephew's numbness to quietly redirect the most profitable business routes toward his own side. A Sterling who felt nothing, was a Sterling who noticed nothing. A Sterling who noticed nothing was a golden opportunity. But recently, Conrad had reported that the boss was going to the ranch every week, that the boss laughed, that there was a woman, and Jerome, who had lived long enough in this world to know that a man who began feeling again was also a man who began seeing again, understood that his time was running out. When Sterling legalized the ranch, his real name appeared in the public records. Jerome found it within 1 week. A horse ranch in Blue Ridge, under the name Sterling Voss, absent from every organizational record. Secret. Personal. Weakness. In the 10th week, on Tuesday morning, Phoebe arrived at the ranch at 6:30, earlier than usual, because the night before she had finished her last call in the next county at 11 o'clock, driven back to her trailer and slept 4 hours, then decided to go straight to the ranch, instead of going back to the trailer to stare at the ceiling for another hour before leaving. She opened the gate, went straight into the stable, and Duchess was standing in her usual corner, uneaten breakfast before her. The feed trough was full. Duchess normally ate breakfast at 5 o'clock. The old horse had habits as precise as a clock, a legacy from 20 years of Ephraim feeding her at the same hour every day. Duchess didn't eat late. Duchess didn't skip meals, unless something was wrong. Phoebe stepped to the feed trough, looked. Hay mixed with pellets, same as every day, but the smell was different, only faintly. Most ordinary people wouldn't have noticed, but Phoebe Wynne had spent 20 years of her life putting her nose near horse feed troughs, and her nose could tell fresh-cut hay from old hay from 3 meters away. This smell didn't belong here. She bent down and looked closely. The color of the pellets was slightly different, darker than usual, and there was a fine layer of powder clinging to the surface where it shouldn't have been. Phoebe didn't touch it. She stepped back, looked at Duchess, and checked her quickly. The old horse stood still, breathing normally, eyes normal, showing no sign that she had eaten. Duchess had not eaten. The horse everyone thought was difficult, stubborn, hard to touch, had stood before her feed trough that morning and refused. Grandma Marisol used to say horses knew. They knew when the food was wrong, when the water wasn't clean, when human beings were lying. Duchess knew. Phoebe took out her phone and called the prepaid number. Someone tampered with Duchess's feed. She didn't eat. Come now. Sterling arrived in 20 minutes, faster than the colic night, and this time he didn't come alone. Conrad sat in the driver's seat of the black SUV, parked at the gate, not coming in. Sterling stepped into the stable, went straight to the feed trough, and looked. He didn't bend down to smell it the way Phoebe had. He didn't need to. He looked at the fine powder on the pellets, looked at the unusual color, and his face changed. Phoebe had seen many expressions on Sterling in 10 weeks. The emptiness of a man turned to stone, the stunned silence when Duchess sniffed his hand for the first time, the tremor in his shoulders at dawn after the colic night, the rusted smile when he was shoved. But she had never seen this. Not cold anger. Sterling had been cold angry for 3 years, the coldness of a machine that didn't feel. This was hot anger. His jaw clenched. His hand closed tight at his side, not to control himself, but to keep himself from breaking something. His cold gray eyes became something living and dangerous, the kind of eyes Phoebe imagined people saw in the moment before a storm made landfall, when the air went still and every winged thing fled. He knew who had done it. She saw that in the way he stood, in the way he didn't ask who, didn't ask why, only stood looking at the feed trough with the face of a man rearranging the world inside his head around a new fact. Sterling turned to Phoebe, and his voice was lower than usual, so low she nearly didn't hear it. Did Duchess eat? No. She refused. I found it before she ate. She said it clearly, slowly, because she recognized this was the most important information he needed to hear in that moment. The horse wasn't harmed. The horse was safe. Sterling's shoulders lowered a little. Only a little. The anger was still there, alive, breathing, but the panic receded when he knew Duchess hadn't eaten. Phoebe stepped closer, stood in front of him, and looked straight into the eye of the storm. Duchess is fine. I found it in time. The feed is still intact. I'll keep it as a sample if you need it. She continued, her voice so calm and practical it was almost absurd in the middle of this. Now, you handle your people. I'll handle your horse. Each of us has a job. Sterling looked at her. This red-haired woman, freckled, in a faded flannel shirt and mud-stained boots, was standing in front of the East Coast kingpin, at his angriest, at his most dangerous, and giving him orders in the most ordinary voice. Not afraid, not because she didn't understand the level of danger, but because the horse needed her focus, and Phoebe Wynne didn't waste focus on anything that wasn't her patient. And in the middle of his anger, in the middle of what was boiling in his chest so hot that he wanted to drive straight to Richmond right now, Sterling Voss almost smiled. Almost. Not quite. But almost. Because this woman had just looked into the eye of his storm and said, "Each of us has a job," as if the East Coast kingpin and the ranch veterinarian were co-workers splitting a shift. He nodded, turned, walked out. Conrad had already opened the car door. Sterling got in, the door closed, the vehicle rolled away, and the storm left the ranch with him, leaving behind the quiet stable where Phoebe was pouring the contaminated feed into a plastic bag, washing the trough with clean water, mixing fresh feed from the reserve supply, and speaking to Duchess in the same gentle voice she used every Tuesday. "Eat, girl. You get a late breakfast today." Sterling summoned the council that night. Not on a regular meeting day, not in the usual conference room. He chose the old warehouse at Norfolk Harbor, the place where Ephraim had once held the meetings only the innermost circle was allowed to attend, the place whose very selection was already a message before Sterling opened his mouth to say anything. 11 people sat around the long table. Jerome Voss sat in his familiar seat, to Sterling's right, the deputy's seat, the seat he had occupied for 30 years, before Sterling was born, back when Ephraim still stood at the head of the table. Jerome looked calm. Salt and pepper hair combed back, gray suit, hands resting on the table, the thin smile of a man who believed he had calculated every move in advance. Calm, because he didn't know Conrad Brandt had been collecting evidence for 3 years. Conrad hadn't collected it because anyone ordered him to. Conrad had collected it because he had served Ephraim before serving Sterling. And when Ephraim died, Conrad watched Jerome begin moving pieces, and took note. Every piece, every move, every day, in silence. 3 years of silence. Sterling stood at the head of the table. He didn't sit. He stood. And when he spoke, his voice was different. The 11 people in the room recognized it immediately, because those 11 people had heard Sterling Voss's voice for 3 years. The flat, emotionless voice of a machine, the voice they had grown so used to that they had forgotten it had ever been different. Tonight, his voice had heat in it. Not the heat of shouting anger, a different kind of heat, the kind of slow fire burning under the earth, the kind that lets everyone listening know the ground above it could collapse at any moment. 3 years ago, my father died, Sterling said. Everyone in this room knows that. Everyone also knows I didn't stop for a single day. I kept running things, kept making decisions, kept everything my father built from falling apart. He stopped, looked around the table. What I didn't know, until this week, was that during those 3 years, someone at this table took advantage of the fact that I was no longer paying attention. The eyes of the other 10 people moved. No one looked at Jerome. That was how Sterling knew all of them had known, or suspected, and none of them had spoken. Conrad stood, opened the file, and presented it in the steady voice of a man reading an inventory. No emotion, only facts. 3 major business routes had been redirected during the first 2 years. Total value impossible to calculate precisely, but enough to buy a team of lawyers and 3 new properties in Charleston under shell companies. 2 longtime allies had been betrayed through leaked information, one losing territory in Baltimore, the other losing a contract in Philadelphia. Both had cut ties with the organization, and Sterling had never known the real reason. Internal information had been sold to a competitor in New York at least 4 times, confirmed through a source Conrad had planted inside the rival organization. All of it had happened during the 3 years Sterling had sealed himself shut. All of it had happened under the eyes of the man sitting to his right. When Conrad finished, the silence in the room was as thick as concrete. Jerome was no longer smiling. His face wasn't afraid. Not yet, but the smile was gone, and that was the first change. Sterling looked at his uncle, and when he spoke, his voice wasn't cold. It wasn't the machine's voice. It was the voice of a human being in pain. "You sat beside my father's bed," Sterling said slowly. "You held his hand. You told me you would help me protect everything he built. Then you turned your back and dismantled it piece by piece, while I was too numb to see." He stopped, breathed. "And this week, you poisoned the horse. The last horse my father rode before the illness took everything from him. the only horse he had left. You knew what that horse meant to me, and you still did it. The room went silent. The 10 others looked down at the table. Jerome opened his mouth for the first time, and Sterling raised his hand. I'm not asking you to explain. I don't care about the reason. The reason changes nothing. He looked at Jerome, and in those cold gray eyes was something the 11 people in the room had never seen in Sterling Voss before. Not anger, not hatred. Disappointment, deep disappointment, the kind only people who once trusted someone completely can carry. You're expelled, Sterling said, effective immediately. Every organizational asset you have is frozen. Every access right is revoked. Every connection is cut. From this second on, you're no longer part of the organization, no longer protected by the organization, and no longer exist in any conversation inside the organization. Jerome looked at Sterling, and for the first time, his eyes showed the thing his smile had hidden for 30 years. Fear. You'll regret this, Jerome said, his voice still managing to stay flat, though his hand trembled slightly on the table. Sterling looked at his uncle one last time. I'm giving you the thing you fear most, he said. Not death. Meaninglessness. Starting tomorrow, no one remembers you exist. Jerome stood, walked out, the door closed, and the 10 remaining people sat in the room, looking at Sterling Voss standing at the head of the table. The man who had been a machine for 3 years and had just made a decision out of emotion for the first time, and not one of them saw it as weakness. They saw it as something more frightening than the machine. Because a machine can be predicted. A human being can't. That night, Conrad called Phoebe. Not because Sterling told him to. Conrad called on his own, because Conrad Brandt understood that the stable girl had the right to know the things that affected her safety. It's been handled, Conrad said. The person who tampered with Duchess's feed has been removed from the organization. Silence on the line. Then Phoebe asked, her voice soft, not judging, only asking, he didn't kill his uncle? No. Another silence. Longer. Then Phoebe said one word, good, and hung up. After the night Jerome was expelled, Sterling disappeared. He didn't call Phoebe. He didn't come to the ranch that Tuesday. He didn't send a message. The prepaid number stayed silent for 2 straight days, and Phoebe let it stay silent. She didn't call, not because she didn't want to, but because she understood silence. She had lived inside silence for 3 years since Grandma Marisol died. There had been weeks when she hadn't spoken to another human being except to say, I'm here to examine the horse, and cash, or check. And she knew that sometimes people disappeared, not because they were leaving, but because they needed a place to set down what they were carrying, and anyone who knocked on the door at that moment would only make them pick it back up again. So she gave Sterling space, the same way she gave horses space after an injection, stepping back, waiting, letting them decide for themselves when they were ready. On the 3rd day, at 4 o'clock in the morning, Phoebe drove the rusted truck back to her trailer after a night call in Augusta County. The last call had been a mare about to give birth. The ranch owner had called in panic at 11 o'clock. Phoebe had driven 40 minutes there, finished helping with the birth at 2 o'clock, then driven 40 minutes back. She was so tired, her vision blurred, her hands holding the steering wheel more by habit than by consciousness, and when she stopped in front of the trailer, she sat still for 30 seconds before she had enough strength to open the door. She stepped down, opened the trailer door, and stopped. The kitchen faucet, the rusted faucet she had wrapped a towel around for 2 years to slow the leak, the faucet whose steady dripping she had grown so used to every night that it had become a lullaby, had been replaced. A new faucet, bright silver, no leak. Phoebe stood in the middle of the trailer, looking at the new faucet, and her eyes moved. She looked out the window, the truck she had just driven home, its own headlights sweeping across the driveway as she parked, and she saw it. New front tires, both of them. Not the cheap tires she usually bought when the old ones were too worn to pass inspection. Good tires, the durable kind, the kind with grip, the kind that could handle the dirt roads of Blue Ridge in the rainy season. Then her eyes turned back inside the trailer and saw the box on the table. A black box, undecorated. No letter, no card. She opened the lid. A set of specialized veterinary tools lay inside, arranged neatly on velvet. A Littman equine fetal stethoscope, the kind she had stood looking at in a catalog for 3 years, and never ordered because it cost 2 months of trailer rent. A specialized needle set for equine joints, the kind only large clinics had. An equine ophthalmoscope. A digital thermometer, and a roll of medical elastic bandage large enough to last the whole year. No letter, no note, no name. Phoebe stood in the middle of the trailer at 4 o'clock in the morning, holding the Littman stethoscope in her hand, and looked around her home. The trailer was small and old, but it was never empty. The walls were covered with Polaroids of every horse she had ever treated, arranged by year, hundreds of them. Grandma Marisol's handwritten notes were pinned to the felt board beside the kitchen, slanted letters in blue ink. Remember to check the hooves before blaming the joint. And if a horse won't let you touch, the fault is in the person, not the horse. A map of the Blue Ridge Ranch country was taped to the refrigerator door, marked in red pen with every ranch she covered. And now there was a new mark, the star she had drawn 4 weeks ago beside the word Duchess. This trailer was her home. Small, old, lacking, but home. And someone had stepped inside while she was gone, taken nothing, only fixed the faucet she had never asked anyone to fix, replaced the tires she had never asked anyone to replace, and left on the table the things she had wanted but had never told anyone she wanted, because saying it out loud meant admitting she lacked something. And Phoebe Wynne didn't admit she lacked anything. She took out her phone, called the prepaid number. 4:15 in the morning. Sterling answered after the first ring. He wasn't sleeping either. "You fixed my faucet," she said. "It was leaking. You changed my tires. They were worn. You bought the tools I didn't dare buy." Silence on the line. Long. Then Sterling spoke, softly, his voice deeper than usual. The kind of voice Phoebe had begun to recognize as the one he used only when saying something true. "You deserve good tools." And Phoebe Wynne, who hadn't cried on the day her grandmother died, hadn't cried when the debt notice came, hadn't cried when her tire was slashed at 5 o'clock in the morning, hadn't cried through 3 years of living alone in a trailer smaller than other people's bathrooms, stood in the middle of her home at 4:15 in the morning, holding a Littman stethoscope, and cried. Not because she was sad, not because she was tired, though she was so tired her bones hurt, but because for the first time since Grandma Marisol had held her hand on her sickbed and said, "You'll be okay, mija. You're always okay." Someone had seen what she needed without making her ask. Someone hadn't asked, "What do you need?" Because he knew she would say, "Nothing." That person had only quietly fixed the faucet, changed the tires, left the tools on the table, and gone. He hadn't waited for thanks, hadn't waited for anything. Tears ran down her face and fell onto the stethoscope in her hand, and she heard Sterling breathing on the line, waiting, not speaking, not asking whether she was crying, just being there. "This is how you say love, isn't it?" she asked, her voice trembling, wet, uncontrolled, with faucets, silence. Then, "I'm not good at saying it with words." Phoebe drew in a breath, wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her flannel shirt, looked at the bright silver faucet in the kitchen, the new tires outside the window, the toolbox on the table. 3 things. Nothing too much, nothing too little. Exactly what she needed, nothing more. "You don't have to be good," she said. "I can read it." She hung up and called back immediately. "Where are you?" "In the car, out on the main road. About 10 minutes from your trailer." He had been nearby the whole time, not watching her. Nearby because after fixing the faucet and changing the tires and placing the toolbox on the table, he hadn't been able to drive away. He had parked on the main road 10 minutes from her trailer and sat there in the middle of the night, not knowing what he was waiting for, only knowing that driving back to the penthouse in Richmond right now felt like going in the wrong direction. "Come here," Phoebe said. Sterling came, parked beside the truck with the new tires. Stepped out. Phoebe stood in the trailer doorway, her hair loose, her eyes red, her flannel shirt wrinkled, the Littman stethoscope still in her hand as if she had forgotten to put it down. She opened the door wider. "Come in." The trailer was so small that Sterling had to lower his head to step across the threshold. Inside, he stood there and felt as if he took up half the space. His penthouse in Richmond had a living room larger than this entire trailer, but the penthouse was empty. 4 white walls, expensive furniture no one sat on, and the silence of a room with no human trace in it. Phoebe's trailer was small, but full. Polaroids covered the walls, hundreds of them, each one a horse. Each horse a story she had lived through. Grandma Marisol's notes were pinned to the felt board, slanted blue ink still there after 3 years, as if Phoebe couldn't bear to take them down, because taking them down would mean admitting she was gone. The map on the refrigerator had a red star beside the word Duchess. Veterinary books were stacked on the floor because there was no shelf. And there was one single chair in the kitchen corner, an old wooden chair with one broken leg, propped up by 3 thick veterinary books stacked beneath it. Sterling looked at the chair, looked at the 3 books holding up the leg, and sat down. The chair creaked, but held. Phoebe took the rusted kettle, poured water, and made coffee. She placed 1 cup in front of Sterling, 1 cup for herself, then sat down on the floor because there was no second chair. They sat in silence. Steam rose from the coffee. The new faucet stayed silent at the sink, no longer dripping, and the absence of that sound felt stranger than Phoebe had expected, as if the trailer itself had changed the rhythm of its breathing. Then Phoebe set her cup down, stood, walked to where Sterling was sitting, and placed her hand over his. Gently, firmly, calloused and warm, exactly the same as the first time she had placed his hand on Duchess's neck in the stable during that first week. "Just leave it there," she said. The same words, the same voice. But this time, it wasn't a horse's neck under his hand. It was hers. Sterling trembled. Not from the cold, not from fear, though perhaps he was afraid in the way a man who hadn't let anyone come close for 3 years would be afraid when someone touched his hand at 4:30 in the morning, inside a trailer smaller than his own bathroom. He trembled because the last time anyone had been this close to him, close enough for him to feel the warmth of another person's skin against his hand, his father had still remembered his name. Phoebe didn't take her hand away. She left it there, just as she had said, just as she had done with Duchess, and with every frightened horse she had ever treated, leaving it there until the trembling creature decided for itself that this warmth was safe. Sterling didn't decide. His body decided for him. His hand stopped trembling, slowly, gradually, like ice melting not because someone shattered it, but because the temperature had shifted just enough. They sat that way for a length of time, neither of them measured. The coffee cooled in the cups. The first light of dawn began to seep through the trailer window, pale, weak, the kind of light Blue Ridge had every morning before the mist lifted, the kind of light that made everything look softer than it really was. Phoebe stood. Sterling stood with her. She stepped out the trailer door and stood on the rotten wooden step, looking across the front grass where the truck with new tires was parked beside the black SUV. And Sterling stood beside her, and no one said anything, and no one needed to say anything. Then Phoebe turned and looked at him, and Sterling lowered his head, slowly, the way he did everything in the stable, carefully, without surprise, giving her time to see him coming closer and step back if she wanted to. She didn't step back. The kiss was slow, tired, eyes closed. Not wild passion, not drama. 2 exhausted people stood on the rotten trailer step just before dawn and touched their mouths together as if it were the most natural thing in the world and the most frightening thing, all at once. It was brief, only a few seconds. Then Phoebe stepped back, looked at him, her eyes still red, freckles across her nose, red hair caught in the early dawn light. And she didn't say, "What does that mean?" She didn't ask, "What are we now?" She only said, "The coffee's cold. I'll make it again." Then she turned back inside, and Sterling stood on the trailer step as dawn rose over Blue Ridge, his lips still warm, his hand no longer trembling, and thought that this was the most ordinary and most miraculous kiss of his life, because it wasn't trying to become anything. It was simply enough. 2 weeks after the kiss on the trailer step, Phoebe lay in the trailer at 3 o'clock in the morning, staring at the ceiling and counting. Not sheep, people, father, mother, Grandma Marisol, 3 people. 3 people she had loved and lost. 3 people who had disappeared. Her parents died when she was 7. She didn't remember much about that day, only Grandma Marisol coming to pick her up at the police station, wearing a green coat, holding a teddy bear Phoebe didn't want but that her grandmother kept offering anyway, and saying, "You'll live with me from now on, mija," in a voice so calm that Phoebe believed her. Then Grandma Marisol became everything. Mother, father, friend, teacher, world. For 18 years, she was everything. Then cancer. 11 months. And Phoebe was standing alone again, this time with no one coming to pick her up. No green coat, no teddy bear. Only the old truck, the toolkit, and the habit of not crying. For the past 3 years, Phoebe had lived by one simple rule. Don't depend on anyone. That rule wasn't a philosophy. It was survival instinct. Every person she had depended on had disappeared, and her body had learned that lesson more deeply than any veterinary lesson Grandma Marisol had ever taught her. Loving someone meant giving them the right to disappear from her life. And Sterling Voss lived in a world where disappearing wasn't a metaphor. She lay there, looking at the trailer ceiling, listening to the new faucet's silence at the sink, looking at the Littman toolbox on the table, and thinking, he came into my home while I was gone, fixed the things I didn't ask him to fix, left behind what I needed without waiting to be thanked, and kissed me on the trailer step at dawn. And I want that. I want him to come every Tuesday. I want the coffee he brings. I want the way he asks why I stand on the left. I want the rusted sound of his laughter when Duchess shoves him. I want all of it. And wanting all of it was the most dangerous thing Phoebe Wynne could allow herself. She didn't sleep that night. She didn't sleep the night after either. For 2 weeks, she came to the ranch every Tuesday, examined Duchess, talked normally, and kept just enough distance for Sterling to notice, but not ask. He didn't ask. He came, brought coffee, held the reins, brushed Duchess, and waited, the way she had taught him, the way she had done with every frightened horse. Step back, wait, let her come on her own when she was ready. On the 14th Tuesday, after she had finished examining Duchess, Phoebe sat on the stable fence, watching Sterling brush Duchess in the yard under the afternoon sun, and spoke. I need to tell you something. Sterling stopped his hand, looked at her, waited. I'm not afraid of who you are, she said. I've read every article. I know what the world you live in looks like. I'm not afraid of that. She stopped, breathed. I'm afraid of losing one more person. Silence. Duchess chewed grass. Wind moved through the ranch yard, stirring the weeds growing along the rotting fence. My parents died when I was 7, she said. And this was the first time she had told Sterling this with her own mouth, not through Conrad's file. My grandmother died 3 years ago. Everyone I love disappears. And you, Sterling, you live in a world where disappearing isn't a question of if, it's a question of when. Sterling set the brush down, walked to the fence, stood in front of her, looking up because she was sitting higher on the rail, and he didn't touch her. He only stood there. I won't promise safety, he said, promising that would be a lie, and I don't lie to you. Then what do you promise? I promise to come home every night. Phoebe looked at him. Don't promise what you can't control. Then I promise what I can control, he said. I'll try. 2 words. I'll try. Not I'll always be here. Not nothing will happen. Not any of the grand promises men in movies made to women so they would feel safe and then broke 20 minutes later. I'll try. Small, true, and true enough for Phoebe to believe, because it didn't pretend the world was safer than it really was. She sat on the fence, looking at the man standing under the Blue Ridge afternoon sun, horsehair clinging to his hands, gray eyes fixed on her without blinking, and she decided, not that she wouldn't be afraid anymore. She was still afraid. She would be afraid tomorrow, next week, maybe forever, but she decided fear didn't get to choose for her. Fear had chosen for her for 3 years, kept her alone in the trailer, kept her an arm's length from everyone, kept her safe and lonely and tired, and she was tired of being safe. I don't promise it'll be easy, she said. I'll be afraid every time you leave. I'll check my phone every night you come home late. I'll be the most difficult woman you've ever met, because I don't know how to depend on anyone without being afraid of losing them. I used to be the man who didn't know how to feel anything, Sterling said. He looked into her eyes, but together, we'll learn how to trust. Phoebe jumped down from the fence and stood in front of him. Close, closer than the distance she had kept for the past 2 weeks. Then we begin, she said. No promise of forever, no promise of easy, only a beginning. And sometimes beginning is all 2 people used to loss can give each other. 1 month after the day, Phoebe jumped down from the fence and said, We begin. Her phone rang at 9 o'clock at night. Not the prepaid number. An unknown number, she answered, and Conrad Brandt's voice came through the line. Calm in the way she had learned was the calm of someone controlling a bad situation, not the calm of someone with nothing to worry about. Miss Wynne, this is Conrad. He's hurt, not badly, but you should come. Phoebe stood in the middle of the trailer, phone in hand, and the world stopped for half a second. That half second lasted longer than any emergency call she had ever handled, longer than the colic night, longer than 11 months sitting beside Grandma Marisol, because in that half second she saw the exact thing she feared most become real. He disappeared, like her parents, like her grandmother, like everyone. Then the half-second ended, and Phoebe Wynne wasn't the kind of person who stood still when someone needed her. "Where?" she said, not as a question, but as an order. Conrad read the address. A private facility outside Charlottesville, 1 hour's drive from her trailer. Phoebe grabbed her truck keys, took her tool bag by instinct even though she knew veterinary tools wouldn't help here. During the drive, she didn't call Sterling, didn't call Conrad back. She drove, both hands on the wheel, eyes on the road, and in her mind she ran through a list the same way she ran through a list when saving a colic horse. What information did she have? Hurt. Not badly. Conrad was able to call, which meant Conrad was conscious. Conrad had called her, instead of Sterling calling, which meant Sterling couldn't call or wasn't allowed to use a phone. Not badly, from Conrad Brandt, a former soldier who had seen enough in his life, could mean anything from a light scratch to a broken bone. She didn't know. She only drove. 60 minutes from Blue Ridge to Charlottesville had never felt so long. She was afraid she would get there and find an empty bed. She was afraid she would see Conrad standing in the hallway with the face she had seen on hospital staff the night Grandma Marisol died, the kind of face that said, "We did everything we could before the mouth even opened." She drove and feared, and kept driving, because stopping wasn't an option. The private facility looked like an ordinary mansion from the outside. Iron gate, cameras, 2 guards standing watch, and Phoebe walked straight through because Conrad had warned them ahead of time. He stood at the door, his left arm bandaged from wrist to elbow, a scratch running along his temple, but standing steady and opening the door for her with his right hand. "Second floor. Last room at the end of the hall," Conrad said. "The doctor has handled it. Left shoulder dislocated. Heavy bruising along the right ribs. Laceration on the forehead stitched. No broken bones. No internal injuries." He spoke as if reading a medical report, and Phoebe listened the way she listened to a horse's blood test results, taking in each item, assessing severity, sorting it into place. A dislocated shoulder could be reset. Bruised ribs needed time. Forehead stitches needed to be kept clean. No fractures. No internal injuries. Alive. She went up to the second floor, walked down the hallway, and opened the door to the last room. Sterling was lying on the bed, his left shoulder bandaged and immobilized, the right side of his face bruised purple from cheekbone to jaw, the stitched cut on his forehead covered by white gauze. His eyes were open, watching her walk in, and the first thing he said, in a hoarse, tired voice, was, "I told you, it isn't safe." Phoebe looked at him, looked at the bandaged shoulder, the bruised face, the gauze on his forehead, looked at the private hospital bed, the sealed room, the closed window, looked at the world he had warned her about from the beginning, the world she had chosen to walk into with her eyes open, and now that world was lying in front of her in flesh and bone, bruised and bandaged. She pulled over a chair, sat beside the bed, looked straight into his eyes. "I heard you," she said. "I'm still here." Sterling looked at her, for a long time, as if searching for a sign that she would stand up, take her bag, walk out, drive the truck with new tires back to Blue Ridge, and never return, because that would be reasonable, that would be what any normal person would do, and maybe it was what he wanted her to do because he wanted her safe more than he wanted her to stay. She didn't stand. Silence stretched. Then Phoebe asked, "How is Duchess?" Sterling looked at her. This woman sitting beside his bed in a private hospital room, after driving for an hour through the night, after seeing his bruised face and bandaged shoulder, and the first question she asked was about the horse. And Sterling Voss, lying in bed with his shoulder aching, his ribs aching, his forehead aching, laughed. Not the rusted laugh from that first time at the fence. A real laugh, warm, rising from somewhere deep inside him where even the bruises couldn't reach. He laughed because in the middle of everything, in the middle of Jerome's side retaliating, in the middle of Conrad's car being cut off, in the middle of the ambush, the hospital, and the bandages, Phoebe Wynne was sitting beside him and asking about the horse, because she was herself, and she would always be herself, no matter what the world he brought to her doorstep looked like. "Duchess is fine," he said, his voice shaking with laughter because his ribs hurt. "She ate dinner on time." "Good," Phoebe said. "She's the priority. You rank second." "Since about the 3rd week," Sterling said, repeating his own words, and they looked at each other and didn't need to say anything more. Phoebe sat in the chair beside the bed all night, Didn't lie down. Didn't sleep. She sat there, her hand on the edge of the bed, close to his hand but not touching, and stayed until dawn seeped through the hospital room window, just like the colic night, sitting beside him. Silent. There. In the hallway, Conrad sat on the bench, his bandaged arm still aching, took out his phone, and texted Dr. Niall Curran. "Boss is hurt." She came. Asked about the horse before asking about Boss. Boss laughed. "I officially give up trying to understand this relationship." Doctor. Curran read the message at 2 o'clock in the morning, lying in bed, round glasses still on, and smiled. Then he opened Sterling's medical file on his laptop, scrolled down to the final line, and typed one more note. Patient displays positive emotion in a high-stress context. Significant progress. Recommend continuation. 2 weeks after the night at the hospital, Sterling came to Phoebe's trailer at 9 o'clock on Saturday morning. Not Tuesday. Not Duchess's appointment hour. His left shoulder still hurt when he rotated it, but the immobilizing bandage was gone. The stitches on his forehead had been removed, leaving a thin pink line that would fade with time, and the bruise on his face had shifted from purple to pale yellow, then almost disappeared. He stepped out of the car wearing a casual shirt, no suit, and holding a stack of papers in a brown envelope. Phoebe was sitting on the trailer step, drinking coffee from her favorite mug, the kettle she still kept even though Sterling had fixed the faucet and could buy her a coffee maker any time, because that kettle had belonged to Grandma Marisol, and there were things that couldn't be replaced with something new. She watched him approach, looked at the envelope, looked back at him. "It's not Tuesday," she said. "It's not Tuesday," he confirmed. "Get in the car. I need to take you somewhere." Phoebe didn't ask where. She set her coffee cup on the step, took her trailer keys, and got into his car. They drove 40 minutes to a small notary office in the town of Staunton. The kind of ordinary office on the ground floor of an old building, with a small sign, fluorescent lights, laminate desks. The kind of place people came to sign divorce papers and rental agreements and wills. No one looked up when they walked in. Sterling sat down, opened the envelope, took out the stack of papers, and pushed them toward Phoebe along with a pen. "These are the ownership transfer papers for the Blue Ridge Ranch," he said, "from my name to yours." Phoebe looked at the papers, looked at him, looked back at the papers, then looked at him again, more carefully this time, searching for any sign that he was joking or still under the influence of pain medication after the injury. His face was normal. His gray eyes held hers without blinking. The kind of look she had learned meant he was saying the most important thing in the room and wanted to make sure she heard it. "Sterling. No matter what happens to me," he said, his voice even, slow, each word carrying weight. "Duchess, that land, will belong to you, legally. No one can take it. No one can seize it. No one in the organization can touch it. It'll be in your name, your land, your home." He stopped. "This is the only safe thing I can give you." Phoebe sat still. The pen lay on the table between them. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead. The notary sat at the desk across the room, typing and paying no attention. "You know what that ranch means to you?" Phoebe said softly. "Your father bought it. It's your last secret, the only place no one knew about. You go there on the nights when you can't sleep. You're giving away your last shelter." "I know," Sterling said, and she understood. He wasn't only giving her the ranch. He was saying, "I don't need a shelter anymore because my shelter is no longer the land. It's you." She had become the safe place he came to when the world grew heavy. In place of the ranch, in place of the dark stable at 2 o'clock in the morning, in place of everything. And because she was his safe place, he wanted to make sure her safe place was something no one could take from her, even if he was gone. "Is this the worst proposal I've ever heard, or the best?" Phoebe asked, her voice trembling slightly at the end of the sentence, which she hid by looking down at the papers instead of at him. "The most practical," Sterling said. Phoebe picked up the pen, looked at the papers, dozens of pages, legal terms, required signatures, stamps. Ephraim Voss's ranch, where Duchess stood in the old stable, where she had sung softly to the old horse on the first night, where Sterling had laughed for the first time in 3 years, where everything had begun. She signed, page 1, page 2, page 3. Each signature was neat and quick, the kind of signature made by someone used to signing invoices and prescriptions, and not thinking a signature needed to be beautiful. But on the last page, beneath the final signature line, Phoebe stopped. She added one line by hand, in blue ink from the pen Sterling had given her, her slanted handwriting resembling Grandma Marisol's notes pinned inside the trailer. Condition: the former owner must come home every night. Sterling read that line, read it slowly, and he laughed. It wasn't the rusted, awkward laugh from the fence when Duchess shoved him, but a genuine laugh of pure relief. This was the laugh of relief. The kind of lightness a person feels when they set down something they've been carrying too long. The kind of lightness Sterling Voss had never known, because he hadn't set anything down in 3 years. "I promise to come home every night," he had said at the ranch fence 2 weeks earlier. And Phoebe, with one handwritten line on notarized papers, had turned that promise into a contract. They stepped out of the notary office in Staunton at 10 o'clock in the morning, Phoebe holding the stack of papers, Sterling holding the pen she had used and putting it into his shirt pocket because he had begun keeping everything she touched lately, not because he was romantic, but because he was learning again how to treasure small things after 3 years of treasuring nothing at all. "Back to the ranch?" Phoebe asked. "Back to the ranch," Sterling said. "Duchess needs lunch." And they drove home, back to the ranch that now belonged to Phoebe Wynne, where an old horse was waiting, and where 2 people used to losing were learning how to keep. That evening, they sat on the stable fence and watched the sun sink behind the Blue Ridge Mountains. Duchess stood in the front pasture, chewing slowly, the old horse's shadow stretching long across the grass in the last light of the day. Phoebe still held the notarized papers on her lap, not letting them go, as if releasing them would make them disappear like every good thing in her life. Sterling sat beside her in silence, looking at Duchess, and his hand slipped into his jacket pocket and brought out something small. A small box. Not a luxurious velvet box, the kind displayed behind glass in a jewelry store. A rough wooden box. Old, the kind someone had kept for a very long time. Phoebe looked at the box. Looked at him. "This morning, you gave me an entire ranch," she said. "What is it now? The whole Blue Ridge?" "Open it," Sterling said. Phoebe lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a layer of white cotton, was a ring, so simple it was almost easy to miss. Silver, not gold, not platinum, no diamond, no gemstone, just a thin, smooth silver band, the kind of ring someone could wear all day in a stable, without worrying it would catch, without worrying it would scratch, without worrying it would hurt a horse when she touched one. A ring for someone who worked with her hands. Phoebe picked it up, turned it in the evening light, and saw the engraving inside. Not a name, not a date, a string of numbers, coordinates. "So you can always find your way home," Sterling said. Phoebe looked at the numbers engraved inside the silver ring. Small, exact, the kind of engraving someone must have had to find a specialist for, and explained that he wanted GPS coordinates engraved inside a wedding ring, and that jeweler had probably looked at Sterling Voss very strangely. "You know I'm going to look up these coordinates immediately, right?" she said. "I know. And where will they take me?" "Here." Phoebe looked around. The ranch, the old stable, the rotting fence, the wild grass, Duchess chewing in the pasture, the place where she had climbed the fence on the first night because she heard a horse in pain, the place where she had sung Duchess through the dark at 2 o'clock in the morning, the place where Sterling had stood in the stable doorway with his hand on his weapon and begun to crack open, the place where everything had started. "Back to the ranch?" she asked softly. "Back to me," Sterling said. Nothing more. 2 words. Back to me. So simple it was almost not enough. And yet it was the fullest thing Sterling Voss could say, because he wasn't good with words. He was good with faucets and tires and coordinates engraved inside silver rings, and Phoebe had told him she could read it. She put the ring on. It fit. The silver was cool against the skin of her ring finger, light, almost impossible to feel, and that lightness was what made it perfect, because Phoebe Wynne wasn't the kind of woman who wore something heavy on her hand when she needed that hand to heal. Duchess stepped closer. Slowly, because of her joints, because of her age, because the old horse no longer moved quickly for anything. She stood beside the 2 of them on the fence, not shoving, not interrupting, not demanding a path the way she had in the yard in the 6th week, just standing there, silent, her muzzle slightly lowered, her warm breath spilling into the evening air, her shadow long on the grass, standing there like a witness, as if the old horse understood that this moment needed stillness, not laughter, needed presence, not attention, and all she had to do was stand there between the 2 people, giving each other the thing both of them had once lost, so the moment could become whole. Sterling reached out and placed his hand on Duchess's muzzle, gently. His fingers ran along the bridge of the horse's nose, where the hair was softest, where Ephraim had once placed his hand every morning before leading her out to pasture, and he said softly, his voice only loud enough for Phoebe and Duchess to hear, "Father will like her." It was the first time Sterling had spoken of Ephraim in the future tense. Not father used to, not father had, father will. As if Ephraim were still somewhere, still had an opinion, still cared about whom his son chose. And Sterling was introducing Phoebe to his father through the old horse's muzzle in the middle of an October afternoon in Blue Ridge. Phoebe heard it and said nothing. She only leaned her head against Sterling's right shoulder, the shoulder that didn't hurt, the shoulder she had learned exactly where it was safe to rest against after the hospital night, and watched Duchess standing in the last light of evening. Three creatures used to losing, standing beside one another in silence, and for the first time, none of them felt as if anything was missing. They were married at the Augusta County Courthouse on a Thursday morning, with Conrad Brandt as the witness. Phoebe wearing her cleanest jeans and the least faded flannel shirt she owned, Sterling wearing a suit but with ranch boots because Phoebe said, "If you wear Oxford shoes, I won't recognize you," and the entire ceremony lasted less than 10 minutes. But the real wedding wasn't at the courthouse. The real wedding began at 7 o'clock that evening, at the Blue Ridge Ranch, when Phoebe and Sterling stood beside Duchess's stable in the last light of October. No guests, no music, no flowers, no minister, no one except the two of them, and one old horse standing in the open stall, her muzzle poking out, chewing hay with the solemn indifference of a creature who didn't understand why the two humans in front of her looked different from usual. Crickets sang from the southern pasture. Duchess breathed, even and slow, the breathing of an old horse used to everything and no longer surprised by anything. The wind moved through the rotting fence, through the wild grass, through the roof of the old stable Ephraim had built 30 years earlier. There was nothing else, and nothing else was needed. Phoebe stood facing Sterling, the silver ring on her finger, the coordinates engraved inside, rubber boots on her feet because the ranch soil was still wet from the afternoon rain. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and no one told anyone who should speak first, because there was no script for this evening. Phoebe spoke first, because Phoebe was always the one who stepped in first. From the first night when she climbed the fence into the ranch because she heard a horse in pain, she had always been the one who stepped in. "I don't promise forever," she said, her voice calm, clear, the same voice she used when explaining a diagnosis to a horse owner, because this was the only way she knew how to say something important without trembling. "I don't believe in forever. I've lost enough people to know forever is the lie people tell each other so they can sleep better." Duchess stopped chewing for 1 second, ears pricking, as if the old horse was listening too. "I promise each day. Today I choose you. Tomorrow I'll wake up and choose again. The day after that too, and the day after that, until one of us runs out of days to choose." She stopped, breathed. "That's all I have. Not forever, but each day, and each day is real." Sterling listened. His gray eyes held hers without blinking, and in those eyes Phoebe saw the thing that had been growing through the months. From the first crack in the stable doorway, at 2 o'clock in the morning, through the rusted laugh when Duchess shoved him, through the colic night when he knelt holding the horse's head, through the exhausted kiss on the trailer step, through the private hospital room, and the notarized papers, and the silver ring, that thing had grown large enough to fill the emptiness 3 sealed years had created, and it had a name. Not love. Something simpler. Life. He was coming back to life. "I lived 3 years like a dead man," Sterling said. His voice was low and slow, but no longer flat like a machine. There was heat in it. There was a tremor, slight, at the end of the sentence. No laughter. No feeling. No looking into my father's horse's eyes because I was afraid of seeing the emptiness. For 3 years I functioned and called it living, but everyone who looked could tell it wasn't. Duchess stretched her muzzle a little farther out of the stall door, warm breath spilling into the evening air. "You pulled me out," Sterling said. "Not because you tried. You never tried to fix me. You just lived. Lived so big, so loud, so messy, so true, that the dead part of me couldn't stand it. It had to wake up because you wouldn't let it sleep in peace." Phoebe bit her lip. Her eyes were wet, but she didn't wipe them, because wiping them would mean admitting she was crying, and she had a reputation to maintain. "I promised to come back to this ranch every night," he said. "Back to this stable. Back to you. And if one day I forget how to laugh, he looked at Duchess. Just let Duchess shove me down. It worked the first time. As if the old horse had heard her name and decided that this was the signal, Duchess stepped out of the stall, slowly, her joints clicking, and walked straight to where the two of them stood. Then she shoved. Not Sterling. Both of them. Her head pushed into the space between them, knocking them off balance and into each other. Shoulder touching shoulder, hand touching hand, and Phoebe fell against Sterling's chest, while Sterling took 2 steps back, trying to keep his balance, and failed. They laughed. Not polite laughter. Not laughter because someone had said something clever. They laughed because the old horse had just knocked over their wedding ceremony. Laughed because a wedding interrupted by a horse was exactly the kind of wedding that belonged to them. Laughed because 3 years earlier, Sterling Voss hadn't known what laughter was. And now he stood in the ranch yard at sunset being shoved into his wife by a horse. And the sound of his laughter rang across the wild grass and the rotting fence and the old stable his father had built. Phoebe wrapped her arms around Duchess's neck, her face buried in the horse's mane, laughing until tears ran down her cheeks. "Good girl," she said. "Perfect timing." A few miles from the ranch, Conrad Brandt sat in his car in the parking lot of a cafe on Route 7, where he had driven to give the two of them space, took out his phone, and texted Dr. Niall Curran. "Done." They laughed. The horse interrupted. "Normal." "Doctor." Curran read the message, smiled, and didn't reply because there was nothing that needed to be said. Normal. That was the word Conrad had used. And that was the most miraculous thing, Doctor. Niall Curran had read in Sterling Voss's file in 3 years. Normal. Finally, normal. 3 years after the night Duchess knocked over the wedding ceremony, the Blue Ridge Ranch was no longer a secret. It was the largest horse rescue center in Virginia, with 12 new stalls built beside Ephraim's old stable. Grazing fields expanded all the way to the foot of the southern hill, and a fully equipped veterinary clinic that Phoebe had designed corner by corner with the meticulous care of someone who knew exactly where every tool needed to be. The Ephraim Voss Foundation funded the entire operation. Sterling named the foundation after his father not because he wanted a memorial, but because it was his way of continuing the conversation with Ephraim that illness had cut short. His father had taught him that power lived in the patience of the hand holding the reins. This foundation was the reins. 23 horses had passed through the ranch in 3 years. Old horses abandoned by their owners, retired racehorses no one wanted, injured horses whose former owners couldn't afford treatment. Phoebe treated them all. Some stayed. Some were adopted. Some only came to live their final months in peace, instead of pain. Phoebe said every horse that passed through the ranch left a mark. And she was right, because the clinic walls were covered with Polaroids of every single one, just like the walls of the old trailer, only more. Sterling still ran the organization. He didn't become someone else. He didn't leave the world he lived in, because that world didn't allow anyone to leave. But he changed the way he ran it, not through declarations or sweeping reforms, but through one simple filter he applied to every decision. Can I look into her eyes after doing this? Not every answer was yes, but asking the question changed enough. Conrad still drove ahead, still stood outside doors, still kept notes. But now Conrad's notebook had one more column he told no one about. Number of laughs this week. The average was 4 to 5. The highest week was 9. The week, a new rescue horse named Bandit chased Phoebe around the pasture 3 times before she slipped and fell into the water trough and sat there laughing until she cried, while Sterling stood at the fence and laughed so hard his stomach hurt. Phoebe was pregnant with their first child. Her belly was just large enough for her to complain that bending down to examine a horse's hoof now required strategic planning, and Sterling had hired 2 additional veterinarians to reduce her night calls, something she resisted for 2 weeks, before Duchess shoved her out of the stable at 10 o'clock at night, as if the old horse agreed that a pregnant woman shouldn't be giving horses injections at midnight. Every conflict had ended. Jerome had vanished into the meaninglessness Sterling had promised him. No one mentioned his name. No one remembered. The organization was stable. The ranch was safe. And Duchess, the old horse who had started everything, lived her final days more loved than any day in the 3 years she had been forgotten. One October morning, 3 years after their wedding ceremony, Phoebe came to Duchess's stall at 6 o'clock, as she did every day. She opened the stall door, and she knew immediately. Duchess lay on the straw, eyes closed, no breath moving, so quiet the stable felt as if it were holding its own breath. The old horse had gone in her sleep, No pain, no startle, no fear. Only closed her eyes and left, the way creatures that have lived long enough and been loved enough leave, peacefully, like a leaf falling from a branch when the season comes. Phoebe sat down beside Duchess, placed her hand on the horse's neck, the place she had touched 1,000 times, the place Sterling had first set the brush and frozen, the place where the hair was soft and warm, now cooling. She didn't cry. She sat and talked to Duchess softly, the way she did every morning, telling her what she had eaten last night, what the weather was like today, that Bandit had bitten the fence again, telling her as if Duchess could still hear, because perhaps she still could. Sterling arrived at the ranch at 7 o'clock. He walked straight into the stable, saw Phoebe sitting on the straw beside Duchess, her hand on the horse's neck, her face calm but her eyes red. He looked at Duchess, looked at the closed eyes, the belly no longer rising and falling, the absolute stillness of a body that had stopped. And he knew. Sterling stood in the stable doorway, the place where he had stood the first night, guarded and dangerous, the place where he had first begun to crack open, the place where everything had begun, and he cried. Not the slight shaking of his shoulders like the night of the colic. Real crying. Tears ran down the face of a man who hadn't shed a tear since his father's world began to fade 6 years ago. Ran over the scar at his temple, down his square jaw, onto his shirt, and he didn't wipe them away, didn't hide them, didn't turn aside. He stood in the stable doorway and cried in front of Phoebe, and in front of Duchess, and in front of all the mornings when his father had led this horse out and had never come back. He wasn't crying because of Duchess. He was crying because at last he could. The wall he had built when his father died, the wall Phoebe had cracked with laughter at 2 o'clock in the morning, the wall Duchess had shoved, the colic night had shaken, the faucet and the silver ring and the vow of every day had worn down, that wall was gone, and the tears flowed through the place where it used to stand. Phoebe looked at him from the stable floor. "You're crying," she said softly. "First time," he said, his voice breaking. "My grandmother said tears are the body's way of proving it's still alive." Sterling sat down beside her. Beside Duchess. His hand found hers, held it tightly, and they sat in the stable at 7 o'clock on an October morning beside the old horse who had left in peace. And Sterling Voss cried for the first time in 6 years, releasing the grief he had carried since his father first fell ill, and every tear was proof that he was alive. That afternoon, Dr. Niall Curran received the news from Conrad. He sat down at his desk, opened Sterling Voss's patient file, the file that had been open for 3 years, and scrolled to the final line. He typed, "Patient has cried. Full emotional response. Grief processed, not sealed. Complete progress. Close case." He looked at the line, looked back at 3 years of active notes and follow-ups, tracing the journey from a patient who once displayed no positive emotion to a man who had finally processed his deepest grief. Then he closed the file. For the last time, 1 week after Duchess passed away, a new horse came to the ranch. A young stallion, black-coated, so thin his ribs could be counted through his skin, with an old scar on his front leg that had healed but would never disappear. The horse came from a case Sterling's organization had handled up north. The former owner had been stripped of the right to keep animals, and when Conrad asked Sterling where he wanted the horse sent, Phoebe answered for him. Home. The horse had no name. No one had yet given him the name he deserved, and Phoebe said she would wait, because a name had to come after knowing who the horse was, not before. They placed him in Duchess's old stall. That stall had been empty for 1 week, and Phoebe said Duchess wouldn't mind, because Duchess was the kind of old horse who would shove anyone out of the way to empty a stall when another horse needed a roof over his head. The black horse stood in the farthest corner of the stall, eyes wild, muscles tight, ears pinned flat, ready to back away or bite if anyone came near. He wouldn't let anyone touch him. Phoebe had tried on the first day. He had kicked and nearly caught her arm, and she had stepped back calmly, because she understood. This horse wasn't vicious. He was afraid, and fear looked like violence in creatures that had been hurt too many times. On the morning of the 3rd day, Phoebe stood by the fence beside the stall, watching Sterling walk from the car toward her, and said, "This one is like you when I first met you." Sterling stopped, looked into the stall through the gap between the boards. The black horse stood in the corner, eyes wild, letting no one come close. Feral. Afraid. Ready to bite anyone who comes near because he's been hurt enough already, Phoebe said. "Exactly like you that first night. Hand on your weapon, eyes cold, ready to face an intruder in your father's stable. Sterling looked at the horse, looked for a long time. Then he stepped to the stall door. Phoebe didn't stop him. She stood by the fence, one hand resting on her belly, watching him. He opened the stall door, stepped inside, slowly, one step at a time. 3 meters from the black horse, then 2 meters. Then he stopped, didn't move any closer, just stood there. His arms at his sides, his hands open, palms facing up, the way Phoebe had taught him years ago to place his hand on Duchess's neck. "Just leave it there," she had said. "Duchess will let you know when it's enough." Now he stood in the stall, hand extended, and waited, patiently, the way his father had once waited while gentling wild horses, the way Phoebe had taught him to wait, stepping back and letting the frightened creature come on its own, the way every frightened creature needed to be waited for, not forced, not rushed, only waited for, until it decided on its own that the hand in front of it was safe. The black horse looked at him, wild eyes, ears pinned, muscles tight, looked at the extended hand, looked at the gray eyes looking back at him without blinking, without fear, without threat, and he didn't step back. He didn't step forward, but he didn't step back. And sometimes not stepping back is the first step. Phoebe stood by the fence, hand on her belly, watching the man who once hadn't laughed for 3 years stand in a horse stall with his hand held out, patiently teaching a frightened horse how to trust again. And she thought this was all any of us are truly doing, standing steady, being patient, holding out a hand, and waiting until someone dares to step closer. Sterling and Phoebe's story began at a stable door at 2 o'clock in the morning, when a kingpin placed his hand on his weapon and saw a red-haired veterinarian singing softly to his dead father's old horse. He loved her before he knew her name, and now he stood in a new horse's stall, his hand extended, teaching a frightened horse how to trust, and finally understood what his father had once said. Power doesn't live in force, but in the patience of the hand holding the reins. Perhaps all of us carry a wall inside ourselves, built from pain, from loss, from the wounds no one asked about, and perhaps all of us need someone who doesn't try to break that wall down, but simply stands beside it, patiently, until we open the door ourselves. If you've stayed until the final minute, thank you so much for listening. How did this story make you feel? Please share with us in the comments. We would truly love to hear the feelings from deep inside your heart. If these moments brought comfort to your heart, please press like to support the channel. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this story today, and subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss good stories every day. We wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.